Hi, everyone. Carter Krishna here for the Florida Squeeze. I want to first thank our social media, and particularly our Twitter team at the Florida Squeeze. I have not been paying any attention to what's going on in the Florida legislature for the first time in my adult life. The last time I was this tuned out of a legislative session probably was like 1991 or 1992. So I have to thank them. They're tuned in. They're tweeting constantly. They're putting forth an important point of view and important perspectives on what's going on in the Florida legislature. I've been much more focused on national politics, international politics, and these guys, Canada. Prime Minister Carney has called an election. Obviously, I've articulated previously my views on how much political tensions and trade tensions and commercial tensions with Canada impact Florida, and how they impact Florida probably more than any other mega state, other than maybe New York, and that's a maybe. 2.5 million Canadian tourists visit Florida each year. Many of them spend weeks on end. Many of them own property in the state. And the attitude in Canada towards the United States has changed. And so I don't want to necessarily talk about that in this video. I want to talk about maybe lessons for us here in Florida as to what's going on in this Canadian election, because I think we're seeing two very clear things happening. One, the slow death of right-wing populism, or the minimization of right-wing populism, which looked like it was going to overtake Canada. 6 months ago, I said Pierre Poilievre would be the Prime Minister of Canada, and he would come in with the kind of mandate that the likes of Boris Johnson, his similar facsimiles in other Western democracies or other anglicized democracies, Boris Johnson and Donald Trump didn't come in with a big legislative majority, come in with a mandate, and had channeled the energy of the anti-vax campaign and all of the populism against wokeism and DEI and the apologies for, and if you don't know this, the Trudeau administration, Trudeau government went really far. If you think Obama or Biden were woke, you should check out or even like left-wing Democrats in the US, you should check out what went on in Canada under Trudeau. Basically even lowered the Canadian flag at one point. But anyway, I thought, okay, that's populism's greatest victory. It's not going to be the AfDA. It's not going to be Donald Trump. It's going to be Pierre Poilievre. It's going to be the Conservative Party of Canada, which is a kind of a newer party in the sense that the old Progressive Conservative Party has merged with the Canadian Alliance and the Reform Party born out of Alberta, Preston Manning. I could go on. I could give you a dissertation about Canadian politics and the populist right-wing movements in the prairie provinces in Alberta and Western Canada versus kind of the progressive conservative Joe Clark, Brian Mulroney, although Joe Clark is from the West himself, but Brian Mulroney, Diffenbaker, Lane, that conservatives in Quebec and Ontario were more associated with. Progressive conservatism, right? The name kind of tells you what it is, right? It's not, that's why Mulroney was not Ronald Reagan, right? And he was not Margaret Thatcher. He was something in between where the left was and where they were when those conservative governments, probably the biggest conservative majorities they've had in history, were in power in the 1980s. So I want to talk about the kind of waning of populism, as well as the left's decision based on current polling to vote tactically. And I mean, that means to abandon the left and to just go with the centrist, the safe bet, because of fear of the populists and fear of Trump and fear of the Americans. So the populist wave that Poilievre was riding, which really began with this anti-woke stuff, Jordan Peterson, he's Canadian, remember? Chris Rufo might as well be Canadian. He lives in Gig Harbor, Washington, which if you're not familiar with, you have to cross the Tacoma Narrows Bridge from Tacoma, and it's like this isolated place, right? Although he's obviously, people may think he lives in Florida because of how much he's done here. But these anti-DEI crusaders were either Canadian or kind of Canadian adjacent. They had a lot of influence over the Conservative Party in Canada, the merged Conservative Party. And then you had the truckers and what happened in Ottawa in 2022, the anti-vax stuff. And from about early 2023 until last month, the Conservatives had a big lead in the polls. and Trudeau's term was going to be fixed term, would have been out. They would have needed to be an election called by October of 2025. And there was no question the Conservatives were going to win it. There was going to be this populist right-wing wave, even stronger than what you're seeing in the United States right now with Trump and MAGA, even stronger. And I would argue maybe in many ways more dangerous, although because, well, maybe not. It's tough because they would have had a governing competence, Poilievre and the Conservatives, that Trump's MAGA movement doesn't have, but then the sloppiness and impulsiveness of the Trump MAGA movement makes it maybe in many ways more dangerous. But then Trump happened. Trump's election happened. The threats to Canada happened. The fact that Poilievre had defined the Conservative Party very early on in this election cycle, before an election was called, as a populist, rabble-rousing, anti-DEI, anti-vax, anti-liberal party. So then the Liberals put Mark Carney, who I'm very familiar with from his time as the governor of the Bank of England. They make him the leader. He's a central banker, so by nature not a left figure. And the Liberals begin to surge in the polls because there's a patriotic fervor that's spreading, anti-Americanism. There's always been an anti-Americanism under the surface in Canada. I think I mentioned that in previous videos. But now it's like, now you can be very outwardly anti-American. And so the Conservatives have stalled. They are a 35 to 40% movement, much like they are in the United States. Now, somehow they got to 49% in this last election popular vote because of the economy and lies and, all of these misconceptions, right? But they are a 35 to 40% movement in Canada. They are a maybe 42 to 45% movement in the US. In the UK, they're somewhere in the same. If you combine the right-wing Tory vote and the Farage vote, they're somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 or 35%. I'm not convinced, as some, that Labour will lose the next election in the UK. By the way, that's potentially as much as 4 years off, so a lot can happen. A lot can happen. So what we are finding, in addition to the stalling of populism, is that there is a very clear tactical decision by voters on the left who have voted for the NDP. Remember, as recently as 2011, the NDP won more seats in the parliament than the Liberals, who were waning at the time. The NDP is kind of a far-left party. Jack Layton was a socialist. Singh, I think, is basically a socialist. And they have been a very popular party among the left. They've done extremely well in Western Canada. In fact, at times, they've been the favored party and the favored rival to the Conservative Party in Western Canada, more so than the Liberals, who are a center-left party, but have always kind of weaved and bopped to public opinion. Trudeau went all the way left. I think Carney is going to come from very much from the middle. The NDP vote is collapsing, particularly in Ontario and particularly in British Columbia, but everywhere. It's collapsing. They got 30% of the popular vote in 2011. That was their high watermark. But even recently, 18, 20%. The Liberals did not win the last couple of elections, but they governed because they were able to rely on the NDP to provide them in a parliamentary system, supplying confidence so that Trudeau would be prime minister and there would be Liberal ministers and the Conservatives wouldn't form a government. So the Liberals have always had that, the NDP and the Greens and Bloc Québécois, who tend to be a little further left, even though they're Quebec separatists, etc. There are no other than Max Bernier's People's Party. There's no other right wing party to form a government with the Conservatives if they're short of a majority. So the Liberals have had that ability to form governments with the more left wing NDP, and it's one of the arguments about Trudeau's wokeness and left wing politics was that he was trying to placate that part of his coalition. I get that. But what we're seeing, what I wanted to address today, in addition to the populist surge stopping at 37, 38% in Canada, not hitting 50 like it looked like they would, not forming a huge majority in government because of the behavior of the Americans, and now a feeling among some Canadian voters you might be getting a Trump-adjacent person in Poilievre to be your PM, and they don't want that. They don't want someone who's not going to be tough on the United States. They don't want someone who sounds like a MAGA person who sounds like Elon Musk, who, by the way, is a Canadian citizen and who is very unpopular in Canada right now. But the thing I wanted to address is the collapse of the left-wing vote for the NDP, because I think you have a lot of left-wing people, far left people. And this is the same thing that maybe had to be addressed in the U.S. and it never really was, as I see so many former progressive influencers, the Matt Taibbis, the Glenn Greenwalds, the Blumenthal, Max Blumenthal, several of them really kind of becoming Michael Schellenberg, even, right? Becoming basically MAGA adjacent, becoming MAGA. And a lot of people I knew on the left who were in DSA or even, further left were Bernie supporters now championing Trump and attacking the Democrats and saying Bernie betrayed us. It's all nonsense to me, but I'm just saying, but they exist. You have to acknowledge these people exist. What I'm seeing in Canada is a very different reaction, which is the left saying, you know what, we'd prefer to have Singh as prime minister than Carney. We really would. We'd prefer to have Singh as prime minister than Trudeau. But the threat coming from the United States, the threat coming from Trump, from Elon Musk, Poilievre is adjacent, right? He's MAGA adjacent. He's backed by people like Danielle Smith, the premier of Alberta, who is MAGA, Jordan Peterson, these sorts of people. We're just going to vote for the centrist alternative. We're just going to vote for the person who can stop the Americans, who can stop Trump. And that might be a central banker that we don't have much in common with, but we know he's not going to go with Trump. We know he's not going to go with MAGA. And I'm wondering if you might see among the left-wing people in the United States who have not flocked to this Matt Taibbi wing of free speech. It's free speech for them, but it's not free speech for us, right? That's their attitude. And the obsession they have with the democratic administrative state and all these kind of nonsensical concepts, in my opinion. If you see voters, let's say Bernie Sanders isn't the nominee in 2028, or AOC isn't the nominee, but it's some centrist Democrat, that they may just fold the tent and say, you know what, we've now experienced MAGA, full throttle MAGA, with Elon Musk running the show rather than an incompetent Donald Trump in the first term reined in by more sensible people like the Tillersons and the Mattises and the Kellys, right? Those people are gone. They're nowhere to be seen. In fact, those people might be voting for Democrats now themselves. So we're going to be more practical about it. We're going to be more pragmatic about this. We're just going to back whatever Democrat. And likewise, the center folding if AOC is the nominee and saying, you know what, we're just going to vote for whoever is not MAGA. Because I think this is the lesson from Canada. We're still 4 weeks until the election. I concede that. But the way things are going, you're seeing populism has its limits in a Western democracy. If the forces opposed to right-wing populism unite. And you also see MAGA and the threat of MAGA and Americanism, and in the case of Canada, their nationalism butting up against not implied threats, but direct threats about the United States threatening Canada's sovereignty. That in turn results in much of the left folding and saying, you know what, we'll just take the central banker, we'll just take the neoliberal Carney over the and I hear this actually from some leftists here in the United States saying, you know what, we're hard on neoliberalism, but it's not this, right? You know, if you have to choose between one or the other, you're going to choose the neoliberal lane. So but that's what's happening in Canada. A lot of NDP voters saying, you know what, Carney's not necessarily our cup of tea, but by golly, he's going to stand up to Trump. He's going to stand up for Canada. He's not going to sell this country to the United States, and he's not going to let the inmates take over and run the asylum, which is what has happened in the States and what will happen, what happened in the UK under Boris Johnson, and what will happen in Canada under Pierre Poilievre. That is their interpretation. So just registering that, and would love some comments and thoughts on how that affects the U.S.